Picture the line running from your rod tip down into the water in front of you. It is sinking slow and steady, the way it has all morning. Then it stops. No jerk, no pull. It just stops sinking about a second earlier than it should have. Most new anglers think nothing of it. They reel in, check the bait, cast again. That was a fish. It lifted the bait on the fall, moved a few inches toward you, and let go before you ever touched the rod. Here is the part that stings. On an ordinary day that probably happened more than once, and you filed the whole trip under nothing was biting. There are 15 reasons a beginner goes home empty. Some happen before you leave the truck. Some happen 2 seconds after a fish is already on your hook. Nobody can promise you a fish, and this video will not try. What it will do is take the guessing out, so you always know what to change next and in what order. Mistake number 1 is bringing everything and choosing nothing. The symptom is a tackle box the size of a toolbox, and 30 minutes in you have changed hooks twice, weights twice, and lures 3 times, without being able to say what problem you were solving. Options are not preparation. Every extra choice is one more decision made with nothing coming back from the water. Pick one setup and stay with it. A medium light or medium spinning rod, a matching reel, and line in the 6 to 10 pound range covers most ponds and slow rivers. Add small hooks, split shot, a couple of floats, pliers, and 2 lures you actually understand. Costs nothing. You already own too much. The exception is reel, heavy timber, thick pads, big catfish or pike, and that light setup gets broken off. Size up before you go. Mistake number 2 is casting a hook and a drag you never checked. This one shows up later and looks like bad luck. Fish come off halfway in, or a good fish breaks you off on the first run. 2 checks, under a minute. Drag the hook point sideways across your thumbnail with almost no pressure. If it skates, it will skate on a jaw too. If it catches and digs, you are fine. Then pull line straight off the reel by hand. It should slide out smoothly, not in jerks, and not lock solid. A reasonable starting point for drag is 1/4 to 1/3 of your line's rated strength, measured with a small spring scale. That is a place to begin, not a law, because your reel ceiling is the weakest link in the chain, whether that is main line, leader, or not. And be clear about the hook. Bent, rusted, rolled over at the point, or with the coating chewed off, and it gets replaced, not rescued. A file touches up a good hook that has been banging into rock. It is not a repair shop. Cost: a small file and a cheap spring scale, bought once. Mistake number 3 is trusting a knot and a stretch of line you have not tested. The symptom tells you exactly what failed. A curly pigtail after a break means the knot slipped. A clean, straight break means the line itself parted. Learn 1 knot properly instead of 5 badly. Wet it before you seat it, which cuts the friction damage that happens as the coils tighten against each other. Draw it down slowly, and leave a short tag end rather than shaving it flush. Then run the last few feet of line between your fingers. Rough, flattened, nicked, or clouded line has been sanded by rock, wood, or shell. Cut it back and retie, and do it again after every fish out of cover. Cost: nothing but seconds. One exception. The improved clinch is a fine starting knot on monofilament and light fluorocarbon, but not on braid or heavy fluorocarbon, where it slips under load. Mistake number 4 is a bait or hook too big for the mouth you are in front of. The symptom is taps and nibbles with nothing hooked. That is usually not a clever fish, but one physically unable to get the whole thing inside. For bluegill and other panfish, use a small hook and a piece of worm no bigger than your fingernail, point left showing. For bass, start with a modest soft plastic or a compact crankbait, not the biggest thing in the box. The version that holds up: small fish can only eat small baits, but big fish eat small baits all the time. Downsize and watch whether taps turn into hookups. Cost: nothing. You are taking bait off, not buying more. The exception is when you are getting bitten off, or everything you land is too small. Then going bigger is a genuine filter. Mistake number 5 is fishing with no idea where the strike zone is today. The strike zone is the band of water a fish will move into. and it moves. In cold water, fish are slower, and that band is tight, so a bait passing 2 feet over their heads might as well be in another lake. In warm water, the same fish comes up and takes it. Time of day shifts it too. Low light early and late usually pulls fish shallower and out over open ground. Bright midday sun on clear water pushes them tight to shade, to weed edges or deeper. So build a rough picture before your first cast. Cold, warming, or hot? Bright or overcast? Then commit to a starting depth on purpose, instead of letting the lure decide for you. Cost, nothing. It is a question you ask in the parking lot. The exception is moving water. Current, wind, and dam releases rearrange fish faster than any calendar will. 5 in, and not one of them lives in the lure aisle. One setup you understand. A hook and a drag you checked. A knot you tested. A bait size to the fish. A starting depth chosen on purpose. Now the ones that happen in the last 10 steps before the water. Mistake number 6 is fishing the bank that is easy to stand on, instead of the water that has a reason to hold fish. The symptom is that you fish the flat, mowed, open stretch with the good parking, because everybody does. Fish are not spread out evenly. They stack where something changes. A shade line, a weed edge, a laydown, a pipe, a creek inlet, a point, a drop. In a stream, the seam where fast water slides against slow, and the pocket behind a boulder. Here is a way to see what your eyes cannot. Tie on a bare weight, about 1/8 of an ounce, and drag it back slowly with the rod, feeling for the bottom to change. Hard bottom ticks and clicks. Soft bottom goes quiet and mushy. Where the feel changes, you have found an edge nobody else on that bank can see. That does not mean bottom change always beats visible cover. Which one matters depends on species, season, and water. But it gives you a second map when the first is bare. Cost, nothing. That weight is already in your box. Mistake number 7 is walking straight up to the edge. The symptom is that you arrive, take 3 steps to the lip of the bank, and fire a cast at the middle. Meanwhile, the fish in 3 feet of water directly below you are already gone. 2 things give you away. The first is your outline against the sky. Because of the way light bends at the surface, a fish looking up sees the world above squeezed into a cone of roughly 97 degrees, and outside that cone, the underside of the surface acts more like a mirror, which is why someone standing tall on an open bank reads very differently than someone crouched low with brush behind them. The second is ground vibration traveling through the bank and the bottom, which fish are built to detect. I will be straight with you there. Nobody has measured how every freshwater species responds to your footsteps. Treat it as cheap insurance, not proven law. So stop about 15 feet back. Walk heel to toe. Keep your shadow off the water and behind you. Make your first cast parallel to the bank before you throw at the middle. Cost, nothing. The exception is deep, stained, or windy water, where none of this matters much. Mistake number 8 is casting at random, or trying to reach the horizon every time. Symptom, 40 casts, no memory of where any of them landed, and the same tired lane straight out in front of you. Distance matters when fish are far away. Usually they are not. Picture a clock face. 1 cast at 10, 1 at 12, 1 at 2, then repeat those angles shorter and again longer. That is a fan, and it covers water instead of repeating water. Fishing a target, a dock post, a stump, a weed point, cast past it, and bring the lure alongside. Dropping a lure straight onto a fish rarely ends well. Your first cast into fresh water is not magic, and I will not sell it to you that way. It is simply the least disturbed cast you get at that spot. Everything after it, the fish have already heard. Cost, nothing. The exception is a big wind-blown flat, where distance genuinely is the whole game. Mistake number 9 is a bait that crosses the fish but never stays with it. This one is quiet, and it is the difference between covering water and actually fishing. The symptom is a bump with no commitment, or a follow that turns away at your feet. Your lure crossed the zone at speed and left. Dwell time is how long your bait stays inside the small window a fish will strike in, and you can add it without spending $1. Pause for a 2 count every few turns of the handle. Let a sinking bait hang on a semi-tight line instead of crashing down. With a float, set the depth so the bait sits just above the weeds rather than drifting near the surface. A fish that follows and turns away is almost never asking for a different color. It is telling you the bait left too fast. Cost, nothing. This is a change in your hands, not in your box. The exception cuts both ways. Cold water and pressured fish usually want more dwell. Warm water reaction bites sometimes want less. Mistake number 10 is changing everything at once, in the wrong order. The symptom is that you switch lure, color, depth, retrieve, and location inside 10 minutes, finally get a bite, and have no idea which change earned it. Change one thing at a time, in order of impact. Depth first, because a fish that will not rise 4 feet does not care what color you are throwing. Speed and action second. Then size and profile. Color and fine detail last, because it is the smallest lever and by far the most expensive. Give every change a fair test. 5 or 6 casts, not 1. And if a spot gives you nothing, no baitfish, no swirls, no follows, no taps, move. Moving is not admitting defeat. It is testing the next likely place. Cost, nothing. The exception is very dirty water, where profile and vibration climb the list, because a fish has to find the bait before anything else matters. 10 down. Setup, inspection, knot, bait size, strike zone, water choice, approach, casting pattern, dwell time, and the order you change things in. Every one of those is about getting a fish to bite. The last 5 are about something almost nobody films, what happens in the few seconds after it already did. Mistake number 11 is fishing without a baseline. Symptom: you cannot tell a rock from a weed from a bite, so you either set the hook on everything or on nothing. Take a calibration cast, throw out over open bottom, and drag your weight back slowly with the rod, paying attention on purpose. Rock is a sharp click that stops the bait. Wood is a dull thud that then lets go. Weed is a spongy load that builds and springs free. Mud is almost nothing at all. 2 or 3 casts and you have a reference. From then on, a bite is the thing that does not fit the list. Usually a soft, sudden weight that was not there a moment ago, or a tick that then moves. Cost, nothing. 90 seconds of your day. On a float rig, your baseline is simply the float sitting still. Mistake number 12 is watching everything except your line. Symptom: your eyes are on the rod tip, or the far bank, or your phone. The rod tip is the part of your setup furthest from the fish. Where your line enters the water tells you first. Keep a small, controlled bow, enough for the bait to move naturally, not a great loop across the surface. Then watch for 4 things. The line jumps. The line starts traveling sideways. The line slowly tightens on its own. Or the line stops sinking earlier than it should have. That last one is where this video started, and it is the most commonly missed bite in fresh water. With a float, do not only wait for it to disappear. A fish can tip it, tow it flat, or lift the weight, so the float rises and sits higher. Any change you cannot explain deserves a response. Cost, nothing. The exception is heavy wind and chop, when your line will lie to you and a float is more honest. Mistake number 13 is using one hook set for every hook. They are not the same, and this is where a lot of beginner fish get lost. With a circle hook, do not swing at all. Reel down until the line comes tight and let steady pressure build. The shape does the work, sliding to the corner of the jaw. A hard snap pulls it straight back out. With a moving bait carrying trebles, keep reeling until you feel the rod load, then sweep to the side. Trebles are small and fine and do not need much force. A violent overhead swing on light line just tears holes. With a single hook in a soft plastic or a jig, reel down to take out the slack, then set firmly. How firmly depends on hook gauge, rod, and how much cover you are dragging the fish out of. A heavy flipping hook in thick grass needs far more than a light finesse hook in open water. Cost, nothing. Mistake number 14 is fighting and landing the fish with the wrong tool. The symptom is that you point the rod straight at the fish and crank as hard as you can. Once the hook is in, your job changes. Stop striking and start managing pressure. Keep the rod bent and the line tight. If the fish takes line, let the drag give it, and never crank against a slipping spool, because that puts twist in your line and loses fish at the same time. Recover line when the fish pauses. Use low sideways rod pressure to steer it away from posts, brush, and weed. Pointing the rod straight at a fish throws away the shock absorption you paid for. At the bank, keep it in the water until you are ready. With a net, lead the fish head first into it instead of chasing it with the rim. Then get your pliers and camera ready before the fish comes out. Wet your hands, support the body, keep time out of water as short as you can. Research on air exposure has mostly been done on particular species under particular conditions, so I will not hand you a magic number of seconds. The honest version is simpler. Prepared beforehand, short out of the water, back in quickly, and know your rules before you go. License, season, size limits, harvest limits, and gear restrictions all change by state, and sometimes by the individual lake. Check your state and local regulations. Mistake number 15 is throwing away the only real data you got all day. Symptom: you catch a fish, you are pleased, and then you go straight back to casting at random. One bite is a pattern waiting to be confirmed. When it happens, stop and note 4 things: the angle you cast, the depth or the count you let it fall, the speed and action, and the type of cover it came from. Then repeat that exact cast before you explore anywhere else. Fish group on the same small features, and the same conditions repeat around a whole body of water. A bite at the shaded corner of one dock is a suggestion about every other shaded dock corner on that lake. A note on your phone after the trip is enough. 3 trips of that and you stop starting from 0. Cost: nothing. The exception is a spawning fish locked on one piece of cover, which tells you about that fish and nothing else. So here is the whole thing in one line, and it is worth memorizing, because it is the order that stops you guessing. Location, depth, speed and action, size and profile, color and detail, detection, hook up, pressure and landing. 8 steps. Work down them in order, and when something stops working, walk back up. Most beginners live at step 5, changing colors in water with no fish in it, and never reach the last 3 at all, which is exactly where the fish you already earned get lost. None of this guarantees a fish. Nothing does, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling something. It removes the guessing, so you always know what to change next and why. Now I want to hear from you, and I want the honest answer rather than the flattering one. Think about the last fish you lost this season. Not the one that would not bite, the one that was actually on. Where did it come off? On the fall, at the hook set, or at the bank? Because I suspect that for most people, the answer is not the one they expect. Tell me in the comments. And if you have a bank trick that has been quietly working for you, put that down too. Somebody reading is going to try it this weekend. Once you can find fish and read a bite, the next question is what to throw at them. That is the next one. See you there.